So, with that business concluded, it's now really my great pleasure to welcome and introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Charles West, to give tonight's lecture. Charles is Professor of Medieval History at the University of Edinburgh, and he has research interests in history of Europe in the early and high Middle Ages. And Charles's work, I'm sure, will be known to many of you. A specialist in the history of Carolingian Francia and its successor societies, Charles's research focuses on changes in ideas and practices of public order, with reference to three principal areas. First, the relationship between religious and secular fields of activity. Second, local society and its relation to hegemonic authority. And third, comparisons of regional, renal, European, and Eurasian scales of analysis. And Charles is the author of 9 monographs, co-authored books, and edited collections, plus numerous articles and book chapters. And of these, the most recent books include Europe in the 11th Century, Beyond Revolution and Reform, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2025. The co-authored Local Priests in the Latin West, Cambridge University Press, also 2025. And The Fall of a Carolingian Kingdom for the University of Toronto Press, published in 2023. And prior to moving to Edinburgh in 2023, Charles taught for 15 years at the University of Edinburgh. So this evening, Charles will introduce us to post-Carolingian Europe by way of the practice of queenship. Whereas medieval kings tended to rule in the same place they were born, queens were routinely foreigners within their own realm. And it's this mobility that made queens so important as cultural ambassadors who were central to the creation of human networks that transcended political borders, a role Charles will explore tonight through a series of case studies. So now, please join me in welcoming Charles West to give his lecture entitled Alike in Appearance but Not in Scope, Queens and the Making of Medieval Europe. Charles.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that very generous introduction. May I repeat my thanks to all of you who've come out tonight on a very dismal and slightly dreary evening to hear this paper. So thank you very much. I want to begin with a game of chess. Already with the game of chess. Because unknown as it was to the Romans, chess came to Western Europe from the Islamic world around the year 1000 or so, perhaps a little bit before. Its name, as you may know, derives from the Persian for king, Shah. It seems to have arrived first in Al-Andalus and moved north from there, although it may have come actually independently into southern Italy. Tracing the movement of this game across oceans and mountain ranges is itself a rich lesson in cultural history, as the work of Christina Ilke has recently shown us. Now, though chess was already centuries old by this point, the first surviving account in Latin of how to play it was written in the Swiss monastery of Einsiedel, early in the 11th century, in a poem called the Versus de Schachis, roughly speaking, a poem about chess. Reading this poem, we discover that the game's rules in Europe were, broadly speaking, the same as when chess was played in Baghdad, or for that matter, in the courts of India, where it probably originated, which is in itself quite an intriguing thought. Nevertheless, the Einsiedel poem does reveal that some changes had been made to the game when it arrived in the north to adopt it to its new social context. Chess is fundamentally, there are probably chess players in the audience, I'm sure there are. Chess, as you will know, chess is fundamentally a war game. And several of its pieces therefore undergo alterations to reflect the new social and military environment. So there were not chariots in Western armies, so someone either misunderstood or perhaps took inspiration from that piece's name in Persian, which is Ruk, and reimagined it as a rockus, right? So a rock or a castle, leading to the weirdly counterintuitive notion of a fortress charging across the board. Because there weren't elephants in Western armies either, that figure became rendered instead as a count, or subsequently a bishop, or in some traditions, of course, a fool or a jester. But perhaps the most significant transformation of all was that undergone by the ruler's chief advisor. Because this piece, the vizier, changed gender and became a queen, therefore introducing for the first time a female piece onto the chessboard, and moreover at its centre. As the unwittingly text recounts, the Latin on the board, but the translation is: the warriors of the first rank hold the first line in the field already described, divided into 8, those are the pawns. The king and the queen are placed in the middle, alike in appearance, but not in scope. Nice. Now, of course, the unwittingly poem is a normative text. It's not evidence of how people really played chess, but there do survive plenty of chess pieces which confirm and illustrate this transformation. The queens from the late 12th century Lewis chessmen, or perhaps better, chess set, mostly held, of course, in the British Museum, just close to here, with just a few on display in Scotland, in Edinburgh, are justly famous for their expressive gestures and faces, but there are many earlier ones too, such as a very impressive set of pieces made in a southern Italian workshop in the decades before 1100, now held in Paris, which includes some queens. And here are, there's a Lewis chessman, I should say, which I'm sure all the chess queens, you're familiar with those with their slightly pained expression of enduring the game, and yes, a comparative pair from, slightly early pair from Paris. Now, the appearance of queens on the chessboard, I think, tells us something about the importance of these women in Western Europe and their role as partners to kings. I think it's significant that when people in 11th century Europe thought about how to translate the vizier, the answer was the queen. And in this paper, I want to unpack one aspect of why that was apparently the obvious choice to make. But I also want to make a broader point too. This paper has in its title, as well as a reference to the Versus de Skakis, that phrase, the making of Europe. Now, many of you will know that's a reference to, or a nod, or really a better, a tribute to one of the most important paradigms for thinking about European history in the Central or High Middle Ages, which goes back to a celebrated book published in 1993. In that book, called The Making of Europe, Robert Bartlett talks not only about Europe's making, but about its Europeanization in this period, a process which he saw operating much of the continent after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire created by Charlemagne in the 9th century. And this book emphasizes something very important, that alongside the notorious and enduring fragmentation which characterized this part of Western Eurasia from the 10th century onwards, there was also a remarkable degree of steadily growing political and cultural consistency, if not quite homogeneity. Bartlett's book was and is actually wonderful. It set the intellectual agenda for and inspired countless students and their teachers alike, actually, and is easily, I think, one of the most original and influential books about medieval history written in the last half century. So if you don't know it, go and read it. But it's noticeable how a lot of the work in the wake of this making of Europe has tended to focus on how men forcefully project their authority. One part of this story is squarely about military conquest, the apparently unstoppable rise and spread of the mounted land-owning soldiers known as knights, and of the castles they built, which soon dotted the landscape, as well as zipping across the chessboard. Alternatively, the making of Europe story has been told through churchmen, through popes and church reform, and through the rise of cathedral school-educated literati. Women do feature here, actually, but primarily as ciphers, as the rhetorical figures of speech through which these men are constructing masculinity, contesting property, and asserting their rights to that property. Although there's recent work by Fiona Griffiths and Emily Kurtziel has begun to put the flesh and blood women back into that picture. So in this paper, I want to contribute and perhaps adjust that making of Europe story by shifting the focus onto a specific group of women, queens. Now, medieval queens are not exactly an under-researched field. On the contrary, right, this is a hugely vibrant area of that discipline. And I was astonished to find that as recently as 1995, they could be described in an article as one of the quotes, one of the most surprisingly most neglected groups of women from the Middle Ages, which is hard to believe, really. A visitor to any high street bookshop today will find it well populated with accessible and high quality studies of medieval queens, while in those university libraries which still have books, their shelves brim with excellent research. So this is a scholarly tradition now so rich and distinguished I can't summarise it here, I'm not going to try, but at least let me mention the names of Teresa Ehrenfeit, Elena Woodacre and Pauline Stafford. Much of this scholarship has focused on individual queens, but much has also been written about queenship as a role or an institution, reaching back here to pioneering work by Marion Fassinger in the 1960s. And historians in this field have worked really hard to ensure these women are featured in the historical analysis as active agents and not, as passive pawns, pointing to their political prominence, which is unusual, in fact, in a global context. But what interests me today is their mobility. I've written about this a little in a recent book, as Lucy mentioned, and others have written about it as well, of course, but I think there's much more still to be said. And the starting point is that the lifetime mobility of queens was much greater than that of kings. By and large, kings tended to stay put. They inherited the kingdom in which they'd been born, and perhaps they tried to conquer a bit more at the edges. Queens, by contrast, tended to move to a completely new place to take on that role. And they did so as a matter of routine from the 11th, 10th century onwards. So they were really quite often, in fact, normally immigrants or emigrants. And the core of this paper then is about how this set of individual migrations collectively links in to that question of the making of Europe. Okay. From the 10th century, in much of Europe, kings started to seek their spouses from outside their kingdom. For the individual women involved in these marriages, some of whom were very young, this must have been a prospect as terrifying as it was alluring. In late 11th century England, a Flemish writer named Gosselin of Saint-Bertin, he's Flemish, but he's writing in England, he evokes the emotions which might or maybe must have been involved. He addresses a woman called Eva, who's become a nun, and he encourages her in her vocation by making a comparison to the challenges faced by future queens. So basically, if you think you've got it bad, think about what queens have to suffer. I quote, it's such a nice quote, so I'm going to give it to you now. The daughters of kings and princes, says Gosselin, raised from infancy in all delight, knowing nothing beyond the splendours and the happiness of their homelands, marry into foreign nations and faraway kingdoms. They are destined to learn barbarous customs and strange languages, and to serve fierce lords and repugnant laws which go against nature. For instance, as recently, the daughter of the Margrave of Flanders married King Knut of Denmark. These girls, having once said goodbye to their parents and their land, cannot or do not want to see their homelands ever again, for married love supersedes all. How many have transferred their kinship and their birthright to faraway places for the sake of earthly gains, from Gaul to Galicia in Spain, from England to Apulia in Greece, setting their hearts on transitory things? And should we be shy about migrating to eternal bliss? Now, we don't sadly know whether Eva is impressed by this comparative argument, but it does, I think, give us a sense of what it must have been like for women facing this next stage of their lives. Some women might well have been quite enthusiastic about it, of course, but we know that not all were. A Swabian woman called Hadvig, for example, who was earmarked for a marriage to a far-off Byzantine husband in the mid-10th century, took decisive action to evade it. And I've got another quote for you. When a painter eunuch sent, by the way, from Byzantium began studying her carefully in order to convey a very close likeness of the maiden in a portrait that was to be sent to his master, Hadvig, who hated the prospects of his marriage, contorted her face and rolled her eyes. And in this way, the Greek was firmly rejected. Also, an early 11th century monastic chronicler recounted, not, I think, unsympathetically. Most women, I'm afraid, were not like Hadvig. They could not put off their husband just by pulling a face when the portrait came. Because women in these circumstances moved so very far, we might, to adopt a phrase coined by Susan Grower Bell, think of them as effectively international ambassadors of cultural change. And that is actually how contemporaries sometimes saw them, although not always positively. Take, for example, the well-known case of Agnes of Poitou. As her epithet indicates, Agnes was born in southwestern France, and she married the Salian German-speaking Emperor Henry III in 1043. And this marriage was, as far as we can tell, successful. And her iconography is very interesting. We've got a couple of these images where she's very deliberately represented on a par with her husband, right, in certain manuscripts. When Henry dies, Agnes acts as regent for their son before stepping down to retire, not back to France actually, but to Rome, where she spent the last decade of her life, with occasional trips across the Alps on the Pope's behalf. But before this marriage was sealed in 1043, an abbot named Siegfried of Gors tried to block it. In a letter he wrote to a fellow abbot, Siegfried's main concern was ostensibly that Agnes and Henry were too closely related to marry, and he provided a family tree to make this point. Very interesting, by the way, for showing the kind of level of dynastic knowledge. But he ended this letter with another point about French influence in the German Empire, which I'm going to again quote at length because it's quite, I was going to say amusing, it is quite amusing, it's also quite insightful. But there is one thing, says Siegfried, which upsets me very greatly, which I cannot allow to pass over in silence. That is about the honour of the kingdom. In the times of previous emperors, this honour flourished very properly in clothing and comportment, in arms and horse riding. But in our days, this has been put in second place, and the ignominious customs of French ineptitude have been introduced in the shaving of beards, in the shameful shortening and deforming of garments, and in many other novelties which it would take too long to list, and whose introduction was forbidden in the time of the Ottos and the Henrys. But today, many people despise the honest customs of our fathers, and they seek the clothing, and at the same time, and very quickly, the perversities of foreigners. Through all this, they wish to be similar to those who they know to be enemies and traitors. And what is to be lamented even more, such people are not only not chastised, but are even treated as close companions by kings and other princes, and everyone receives a greater reward the more promptly they copy these stupidities. The others see this and do not blush to copy them, and because they see that they're tolerated and rewarded, they rush to think up even greater novel insanities. For these and other things, O Father, I grieve very greatly, since with these foreign changes, so too customs change, and we see in a kingdom hitherto more honourable than others that murders, rapine, perjury, betrayal, and various deceptions are gradually increasing. We fear these are signs of greater ills. A very grumpy monk. Siegfried does not mention Agnes here explicitly or directly, but the reader is left to put two and two together. Okay? For Siegfried, Agnes's imminent arrival from France was associated with what he saw and decried as a Frenchification of a once noble German court. So this is then a very negative coding of Agnes's cultural influence. But sometimes contemporaries also express more positive responses to the cultural influence that they perceived as embodied in queens. And another example here is presented, another famous example, by Margaret of Scotland, sometimes known as Margaret of Wessex, because she had been born into the West Saxon royal family, although to a branch of that family in exile. Now, in 1057, Margaret returned to an England she had never actually seen, along with her brother Edgar. But a decade later, the Norman conquest meant that she needed refuge, and she found it in Scotland. And then Margaret married King Malcolm III around 1070 and spent the next 3 decades of her life in the Scottish kingdom, where she died around 50. Now, the prior of the Cathedral of Durham, a man called Turgot, who was also her spiritual advisor, wrote a hagiographical account of Margaret's life not long after her death. And like Siegfried, he emphasises the changes which this foreign queen brought to the royal court. But unlike Siegfried, he does so in a celebratory light. Again, a long text, but I think it's worth quoting in full. The Queen Margaret on her side, herself a noble gem of royal lineage, more ennobled the splendour of her husband's kingly magnificence and contributed no little glory and grace to the entire nobility of the realm of Scotland and their retainers. It was due to her that the merchants who came by land and sea from various countries brought along with them for sale different kinds of precious wares, which until then were unknown in Scotland. And it was her instigation that the natives, the Indigeni of Scotland, purchased from these traders clothing of various colours with ornaments to wear, so that from this period, through her suggestion, new costumes of different fashions were adopted, the elegance of which made the wearers appear to be renewed. Further, she introduced so much ornamenta into the royal palace that not only was it brightened by the many colours of the apparel worn in it, but the whole dwelling blazed with gold and silver. The vessels employed for serving the food and drinks of the king and to the nobles of the realm were of gold and silver, or were at least gilt and plated. Now, needless to say, Siegfried and Turgot are both offering skillfully and artfully constructed representation of foreign queens' cultural influence, and historians should and have thought hard about the purpose and the audience of these receptions. But that does not mean that the phenomenon they're describing was itself fictional. Indeed, if we're thinking about the way that queens brought external cultural influences with them, we can turn to the material evidence as well as the text. Francesco Marzella has recently argued, for instance, that Margaret treasured a special relic, a part of the Holy Cross, which she had acquired from her grandfather, the English King Edmund Ironside, and which she, by the way, later bequeathed to her son, King David. So she demonstrably did not forget her own family, and Turgot says in her last moments that that's what she wanted to see and to hold, by the way. And we might be able to associate with Margaret the adaptation of a Scottish prayer book, now held in Edinburgh University Library, which has been adapted to English taste. As you can see, it's kind of done an insular Irish style, but one page has been repainted in a Southern English Winchester aesthetic, right? And this may or may not be Margaret behind this. Another manuscript sheds light on a very different travelling queen, and one who's a bit less well known actually than Agnes or Margaret. And this is a woman called Gertrude. And I should say, for most of what follows, I'm relying on the work of a Ukrainian historian called Talia Zajac, who's writing a full study of Gertrude, which I'm sure will be brilliant. Gertrude was born into the Polish royal family. She's the daughter of King Mieszko II and his wife Rikeza. And aged about 20, in 1043, Gertrude travels to Kiev, Rus, where she marries Izyaslav, who's often today labelled as a prince in literature, but whom contemporary Latin sources usually just regard as a king. She spent 20 years in Kiev, Rus, before she and her husband were exiled back to Poland in 1068. And actually, they then returned, though, to Kiev, and though the politics were stormy, she seems to have stayed there and actually died in Rus. But we know she did not go to Rus empty-handed. But she took with her, in fact, a prayer book, which still survives today, and which has a fascinating biography of its own, which has been explored by Elizabeth van Houts. It's a remarkable manuscript, because it was already old by the time she had it. It's actually an Etonian prayer book, which she then amended and had illustrated. And amongst her changes, she copied dozens of personal prayers into the manuscripts, and several of these are about her own anxieties and her fears for her son, Peter. Quote, St. Helena, she prays, who asked the Lord that he might send his angel to your son Constantine and warn him to aim for and do everything that your soul desired, and that was your will. I, a sinner, beseech you and wish, and certainly request that you pray to God that he may send his angel to my son too, so that he might not resist my will and will follow my advice. The son is obviously perhaps not listening to his mother as much as he should. She was a woman who has her own views, and she wants her son to follow them. But she also copies in various Trinitarian theological formulations which would have raised orthodox eyebrows. And most vividly of all, she adds, there's the quote, she actually adds in depictions in Byzantine style into the manuscript, creating a kind of hybrid cultural artifact which kind of reflects her own lived culture. Now, these examples could be multiplied. Plenty more examples of queens exerting or being perceived to exert cultural influence. It remains the case, of course, it's terribly difficult to measure the specific cultural influence of any single marriage. Empress Theophanu, for example, the wife of Otto II, a German emperor, is a case in point. Lots of historians have tried to associate her with a Byzantinization of the Etonian court culture. And actually, by the way, contemporaries made a similar point, blaming her for new fashions in jewellery to women who followed her to perdition. But as Rosamund McKittrick has argued, Theophanu's marriage was a symptom as much as the cause of 10th and 11th century Germany's fascination with Constantinople. It's impossible at the end of the day to measure her impact, Theophanu's impact on Ottonian court culture in isolation from all the other influences. And this, of course, applies to really all the women I've been talking about so far. It is also true that some of these queens were very young women, as I've said, who were also expected, at least to some degree, to integrate into their new cultural milieu. As Gosselin said, these queens were, quote, destined to learn barbarous customs and strange languages. And, we know, by the way, that Theophanu, who's Greek-speaking, of course, she learned Latin when she arrives in the West. And actually, there survives a psalter in Trier, which is in Greek with Latin interlinear translation, which she may have used to do so. This might be associated with Theophanu learning Latin. And actually, sometimes this integration was so profound that, in fact, quite often, it required these queens not only to learn a new language, but to change their name to fit in. The point nevertheless remains, though, that for contemporaries, migrating queens were associated with a degree of cultural encounter that was baked into the royal family itself. And that was indeed sometimes part of the intention of the alliance. And at a basic level, I see no reason to doubt that. Women travelled, they brought things with them, especially books, and we cannot expect that they will simply immediately refashion themselves from scratch when they arrive at their new homes. Nor is there any reason to suppose that their cultural baggage had no impact on their new homes. Most, when widowed, remained in their homeland, but it's interesting that others did not, sometimes preferring to return to the land of their birth and childhood, having kept up links all the while. Now, why should these women and those they travelled with not have left some imprint on royal courts? Now, this observation is hardly novel. It was actually already expressed by Richard Southern in 1953. But I think it takes on a new sense when we consider the scale and extent of this exchange, when we combine all these movements together. And I think it's most powerfully expressed visually thanks to a wonderful graphic of 11th and 12th century marriages, originally designed by the Austrian historian Johannes Preiser-Capella in 2018, of which here is a redrawn version. And this graphic was one of the inspirations for this paper, and it's inspired other historians too. Simply drawing on a page or a screen the known marriages in this period, the 11th and 12th century, I think it gets across more vividly than any description the intensity and nature of this evolving network, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, from the Channel to the Bosporus and beyond. So behind each of these lines is a woman's life, right? And in aggregate, they create something quite remarkable. And I should say these are, of course, only the marriages that we know took place, and there are others which were planned and never did. And vivid though it is, though, what an image like this cannot do is bring out the historical layering involved, the time depth, I guess, as well as the spatial extent, because these marriages built on top of one another, creating in the process crossovers and overlaps. And sometimes that's the case, by the way, with individual women. For example, the daughter of the Margrave of Flanders, invoked by Gosselin of Saint-Bertin, I mentioned him at the beginning of this paper, she marries the King of Denmark, just as Gosselin observes. Actually, in 1092, though, when the Danish king dies, Adela marries again, this time, though, to a Norman lord in Apulia in southern Italy, thousands of miles to the south. Still more important, though, I think, is the generational layering involved. Because actually, most of the queens I've mentioned were themselves children of long-distance relationships, so to speak. So, Empress Agnes, I mentioned her, she was born, as I said, in Poitou, but her mother actually came from Burgundy. Margaret's father was English, but her mother, Agatha, was not. She may have been Rus or German. Queen Gertrude, with her Prayer book, she is generally thought of as a Polish princess, Gertrude of Poland, and so she was. She's the daughter of a Polish king, Mieszko. But her mother, Richeza, was not Polish, but from the Rhineland in Germany. And through her, Gertrude was descended, actually, amongst other people, from Theophanu, who I mentioned earlier, as well as from Rhineland counts. Her paternal grandmother, meanwhile, was a Czech princess called Dubrovka. So in short, Gertrude was a European princess, through and through. Our royal genealogies for this period, and from this period too, are almost always decidedly androcentric. Female-focused genealogies are much harder to draw in depth, as you can imagine, but they would look completely different and much more cosmopolitan. Now, the creation of this vast kingship network was not inevitable, and nor was it atemporal. It is true that virilocality was the long-standing custom in Europe at all social levels. In other words, women generally tended to move to join their husbands' families rather than the other way around. But that practice, that custom, does not in itself necessitate the specific kinds of long-distance marital exchange I've been talking about. And as Regine Lejeune has pointed out, these long-distance marriages have their own history. They've got their own rhythm. The Roman emperors had not generally married women from outside their realm. Women had moved for royal marriages in the post-Roman landscape as the kingdoms that emerged in the West in the course of the Roman Empire's transformation were steadily woven into transregnal marital alliances, such as those that developed by Theodoric Ostrogoth in the early 6th century, or the Frankish rulers in the 8th century. But that post-Roman pattern of distant marriages ground to a halt as the Carolingian Empire became the dominant force in the later 8th century. Its male rulers not only conquered their neighbours, which made marital exchanges harder, they also disdained or refused sometimes to marry foreign women, with only a few exceptions. As a consequence, then, for several generations, queens in Western Europe migrated for marriage only seldom and occasionally. So the pattern I've been talking about in this paper was the re-emergence of an earlier phenomenon, but now on a much larger scale and in a much more sustained manner. It continues with ever-growing and ever-thicker documentation into the later Middle Ages, but its point of origin is the 10th and 11th centuries. How can we account then for the renewal of this network? Well, I think we might start by not taking it for granted. As Walter Pohl has pointed out, the Old Testament recorded dire threats against those who sought to marry outsiders or foreigners. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, where the Israelites are instructed concerning foreign peoples, do not intermarry with them. Right? Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, because they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Now, Pope Stephen III used these threats to try and deter Charlemagne and his brother Carloman from marrying a Lombard princess in the 770s. The Pope bluntly declared that no one who has taken a wife from a foreign race has ever escaped guilt. So in other words, there are ideological resources at hand for limiting these marriages. Contemporaries knew about these, but they very seldom deployed them in practice, even as marriage with foreign queens became kind of default and the norm. So I think to explain the renewal of these long-distance marriages from the 10th and 11th centuries, there are two crucial contexts, of which one is religious and one is political. And first is, of course, the question of incest. As some people know, clerics and church councils deliberately expanded the definition of incest dramatically from around the year 1000, so defining basically you're not allowed to marry, with the result that marriages with sixth cousins became formally prohibited. So that is, in other words, anyone who shared your great, 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 great grandparent. Before eventually popes in the 30th century reined that back in. It was slightly impractical. And this broadened definition of incest might well have prompted kings to look further afield for their spouses, and actually there is one piece of evidence to suggest that it did. Around 990, the new French king Hugh Capet wrote a letter to request a Byzantine bride for his son Robert, saying he had no choice but to look so far afield, quotes, because of kinship with neighbouring kings. Perhaps unsurprisingly, an appeal framed as, please help because I can't get anyone better, doesn't net the desired result. That never happens, that marriage. Robert does find a wife, Bertha, and ironically enough, actually that marriage is later annulled due to consanguinity. Which in itself, of course, shows that kings sometimes did not shy from marriages which technically fell within the very expansive definitions when they're otherwise advantageous or good reasons to do them. And ultimately, you might argue that these very long distance marriages, they postpone rather than solve the question of incest, right? Because you're just related to more people. There is a second relevant context then, which is the political fragmentation, which I mentioned earlier. So Simon MacLean has shown how the emergence of multiple dynasties as the monopoly of Charlemagne's family collapses in the transformation of the Carolingian Empire, how this led 10th century rulers to seek cross-border alliances to kind of prove and bolster their kingly status in that particular context. What's interesting, though, is how these dynamics very quickly expand beyond the former Frankish lands, integrating the rulers in the east and the north who are in the process of converting to Christianity. So in other words, if this starts as a distinctly post-Carolingian Frankish phenomenon, it does not stay that way. I suggest that the rise of the foreign queen from the 10th century tells us something about kings' efforts to distinguish themselves from their aristocracy in an environment where the traditional public frameworks of power were absent or had been shaken, where links with distant prestigious families affirm royal status as much as whatever normative and liturgical frames were operating locally, where kingship needed prestigious kinship, so to speak, to be operational in a very different way from that of the Carolingians of the past. And here I want to come back to then the making of Europe. It's important to remember, as Klaus Oskama has recently insisted, that contemporaries in the period I've been discussing did have a conception of Europe as a conception of a geographical space. It was not considered relevant usually anyway, or explicitly for individual or group identities, but it existed. Indeed, the first known map of Europe was made in Flanders in the early 12th century by a cleric called Lambert of Saint-Omer. It's not the first map to show Europe, I should add, it's the first map which is only of Europe. And you can just about see, I can help you read this. Spain is at the bottom, Italy's at the top, so it's kind of slanted at and this is also a fascinating map for the other reason. It is also the first map I am aware of which showed political boundaries on the map itself. Okay, so previous maps, there have been many, did not show political maps. You can just about make out a red line in that map, which demarcates the boundaries, the edges of empire. Now, the network I've been talking about was not exactly the same as this space. It stretched over a lot of it, but for a long time, not all of it. As you may have noticed earlier, there are significant absences in Priza Capella's marriage map. Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus on the one hand, and actually Ireland on the other. Now, to some extent, that reflects the limitations of the data set the map was based on, Priza Capella's graphic. In truth, there were a handful of marriages between Christian and Muslim ruling families in Iberia, and actually also, by the way, of pagan nomads in the east, which weren't in that data set but should have been. And it's also true, by the way, that aristocratic Norman families sometimes married Irish princesses. But these don't, I think, really change the picture. Contemporaries certainly thought of Ireland and Andalus as part of Europe, but from the point of view of royal dynastic politics, they were not in view. Equally as striking as the absences on our marriage map, of course, are the presences. And yes, you might have noticed the short-lived Latin settlements in the Eastern Mediterranean, but maybe more importantly, I will actually go back to the previous slide, the participation, indeed the centrality here of Byzantium, of which 37 cross-border marriages have been totted up, despite, by the way, reluctance about it, even a formal ban on these marriages in the 10th century. So the realm of what some historians now call East Rome was not a sphere apart, nor some fossil surviving from the ancient world. It was as much part of this network as anyone else, and actually engaged with it on a similar timescale as well. And the same can be said as well, of course, of the lands that were religiously and culturally oriented to Constantinople, including Kiev Rus. In the 1970s, Dmitry Obolensky called these lands around Byzantium, he called them the Byzantine Commonwealth. But as Christian Raffensperger has noted, these dynastic marriages challenged that concept, right? These places were not only oriented to Constantinople. For contemporaries, kingdoms such as Kiev Rus were absolutely part of a trans-European royal kinship network, and were not simply satellites of Constantinople. The Rus king Yaroslav and his Swedish wife Ingigerd, for example, arranged marriages for their children with the ruling families of no fewer than 4 kingdoms: France, Poland, Norway, and Hungary, all to their west in the 11th century, as well as possibly Byzantium too. So what we see, therefore, is not so much, I think, a making of Europe here, as the emergence of a network of kingdoms which deliberately set up marriage alliances with one another over a long period of time. This process, I think, reflects but also promotes a tacit notion of a community of realms, a kind of established international politics in the perspective of recent work by Jenny Benham on that concept. These marriages were arranged to try to create peace between these kingdoms. That's what some contemporaries stressed. And actually, of course, this process was fundamentally a peaceful one. Through repeated and persistent alliance and exchange and not colonisation, this promotes a kind of soft kind of cultural integration which goes far beyond the old Frankish Empire. A cultural integration of which contemporaries, as we've seen, were themselves aware whether they viewed it positively or negatively. Kings in their courts consciously and strategically chose these queens. They sought the connection that these women embodied. Ruling families wanted their children to be part of this growing network. They're not compelled, they're opting into this Europeanisation. Now, this does not, of course, mean that the consequence of this process was inherently peaceful. As Len Scales recently noted, growing integration does not sadly equate to a rosily harmonious coexistence. It can also lead to, as he says, narcissisms of small difference. While the creation of cross-boundary kinship links surely must have promoted a degree of mutual cultural understanding and influence, they also laid the seeds for future wars over inheritance. The opposite of a network, of course, is not war or violence. The opposite of a network is the absence of interaction altogether. Right? And the connections which form a network can be created and activated for all kinds of purposes. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. I began this talk by pointing to the Queen's appearance on the chessboard in the 11th century. But it's not actually just her presence on the board that's interesting. What's interesting is also how she moves across that space. The 11th century chess queen was not actually quite as powerful as the modern version. She can only move along diagonally. but she could still cross the board with a single jump, travelling much further than her spouse, who was limited, as he still is today, to this plodding around the squares immediately around him. By chance or by design, the game thus mirrored something of the realities of European courts. Queens in real life too frequently travelled a very long way, uprooting themselves to start a new life in a new land, sometimes migrating across almost the whole continent. This must have been traumatic at an individual level for brides and actually also for their families. But it's the collective and cumulative effect of these movements in which this talk has been chiefly interested. The cultural links and dynastic bonds that these foreign marriages created from the 10th century onwards spanned borders and steadily create a new elite across European royal kinship group. Now, these alliances don't wash away or erase cultural, political, or religious differences. Europe as a space remains multilingual and multicultural, characterised by variety, just as it does today, just as you'd expect from a vast space that reaches from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle and from the Atlantic to the plains of the East. Nor do they always bring these marriages always bring with them long-term peace, and sometimes, as I've said, quite the opposite. But nonetheless, they constituted vectors of integration at a very elite level, a kind of secular counterpart to the similarly wide workings of the Roman Church, whose definitions of incest, as I said, also played some role in the phenomenon as well. So in their individual migrations then, these women played a part in integrating a vast area in the absence of any formal public structures of coordination, creating in this way a human network and not an empire, which steadily widened its reach. The Einsiedlung versus des Skakis, that poem I began with, described kings and queens as standing together at the centre of the chessboard. It described them, you'll remember, as alike in appearance but not in scope. In that vein, it's been the argument of this paper that distinguishing queens from kings and focusing on their mobility offers a fresh perspective on the post-Carolingian so-called making of Europe. A network certainly does emerge in the 10th century, and it gathers momentum in the 11th century into the 12th in a very specific religious and political context, which knits together these far western Eurasian territories for better or for worse. Focusing on queens challenges our preconceptions, so our perceptions of how this process worked. But perhaps more importantly, it provokes us to rethink what this network really was in the first place, a space held together by the movement of women as much as that of armoured knights or papal envoys. Thank you very much.